We've talked Graham Mertz. We've talked Jack Miller III, but what if the dark horse Max Brown wins the starting quarterback battle? Well, we'll talk about it here on Locked On Gators.
You are Locked On Gators, your daily podcast on the Florida Gators. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Locked On Gators, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thanks for making Locked On Gators your first listen of the day. We're available daily and free wherever you listen to podcasts. Happy Friday. I'm Brandon Olson. Find me on Twitter at WNS_Brandon. Written work with Whole Nine Sports, Giants Country, NFL 33. This episode of Locked On Gators is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, the official sportsbook of Locked On. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. And now we're talking about the dark horse, which, yes, all of us can acknowledge that Max Brown is probably the least likely candidate to be the starting quarterback of the even somewhat realistic options. Of course, Michael Leone, Parker Lisey, Jordan Guile, not actually in this battle. Max Brown, it really isn't too deep in the battle, but he is someone to consider because he is someone that's in there. He's a scholarship quarterback. So, Scally quarterback, we're going to consider you. And it is also important to remember that for Max Brown, unlike Graham Mertz, but like Jack Miller III, there's an incredibly small sample size. But for Max Brown, there's really no sample size outside of this is what he's done in practice, because he, of course, hasn't played in a college football game at all this season or this career. So yeah, he's got the smallest sample size of the bunch. But for Max Brown, it's also important to remember that he's the most athletic of the bunch. And I think that's the biggest talking point for any Gators fans that want him in this battle, is that Max Brown is easily the most athletic quarterback in this battle. And he's not just the most athletic because he's average to above average athleticism. No, he's genuinely a pretty good athlete. Like, he has had no problem making plays with his legs in high school or in practices. So he brings that element that Florida had last year in their offense to an extent. He's not as athletic as Anthony Richardson, but he brings that athletic element that Florida had in their offense that Graham Mertz doesn't bring, or that Jack Miller III doesn't bring. And is that enough to warrant, hey, you should get a look in the starting quarterback battle? For some people, yes. For some people, no. Obviously, it's a mixture of everything because Billy Napier, Ryan O'Hara, Rob Sale, what they're looking at isn't, are you the best passer? Are you the most athletic? Do you give us the best chance to win? And depending on who you are, maybe you think Max Brown's athleticism does that for you. Maybe you think it doesn't. Maybe you're like, his name is Cole. I forgot the last name. I'm so sorry. But Cole left a comment on YouTube on Wednesday, and he was like, well, if you're going with an experience, go with Max Brown. Maybe that's what it is, because the upside of Max Brown. But as far as athleticism goes, Max Brown had 1,300 rushing yards, 1,300 rushing yards in high school as a senior. So he did all that in 1 year. He had 1,300 rushing yards. So yeah, he's pretty damn athletic, right? So you could talk about that. You could also talk about the arm talent point of things from Max Brown, because I think for anybody that's seen Max Brown throw a football, whether it's practice or his high school tape, which, by the way, I want to make this abundantly clear. When Max Brown committed to Florida last year, before the last signing period, I will say that I was pretty public. I loved what he brought to the table. Like, I love the arm talent that Max Brown brought. I thought he was completely overlooked by Gators fans and by national media early on because he was a low-ranked quarterback. He had offers from Washington, and that was Washington and Temple, I think, were the two biggest outside of Central Michigan where he was committed to, and outside of Florida, of course. So I will say raw arm talent, it's there. And as much as I hate talking box score, there are some times where you can look at the box score and you could say, okay, this is what he does well, this is what he doesn't do well. And there are also some times where you can kind of talk about that and use that as an indicator, because you can also say, hey, programs look at this kind of stuff because it does help evaluate. And there is merit to using this box score because it works in certain areas. Like, you could talk about this and you got to combine it and use it in context. Like for Max Brown in high school, his completion percentage, 71.6% throughout his career, and he had 12.4 yards per attempt throughout his career. When you combine those, they're pretty damn good. When you look at them separately, they don't mean anything because you'd have 12.4 yards per attempt, but you can complete 40% of your passes. It's just you're throwing a ton of deep balls. You can complete 71.6% of your passes, and it might not be super impressive if you're in an offense that throws just a ton of screens everywhere. So there's that where you have to kind of take that into context. But then when you take those numbers and you go, okay, these numbers combined are worth a look at the film, and then you look at the film, you see Max Brown is pushing the ball downfield pretty consistently. And when you push the ball downfield consistently and you have an insane completion percentage like that, that's usually a pretty good indicator that, okay, your arm talent is there because you're getting the ball downfield and to the receivers in a catchable area. And that's impressive there. So that gives you that look at Max Brown. You also watch how he throws the ball. You watch that there's a pretty tight spiral, gets solid zip on the ball pretty consistently. Based on what we've seen in practice, based on what we've seen in high school, Max Brown has, we'll say Max Brown has the tools to be great. That's what we talk about when we're talking about Max Brown, is we're talking about the tools that he brings to the table. When you're looking at Max Brown as an option here, that's kind of what you're looking at. You're looking at what does he bring to the table? Because you don't look at Max Brown and you go, okay, he's got everything we need. Because Florida doesn't have a quarterback on roster that has everything you need. But you're looking at, can we make him what we need him to be? Arm talent's there, both in strength and relative accuracy. Athleticism's there. If you can get it right between the ears, you've got it figured out, I think. But will that happen? Because there's quite a few negatives to talk about with Max Brown, which we'll get to in a second. But first, today's episode of Locked On Gators is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, America's #1 sportsbook. And new customers, guess what? You get a no sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's up to $1,000 back in bonus bets if your first bet doesn't win. And I will say this, I like talking about betting. I like talking about what I bet. And by the time that we're recording, or that you're listening to this, you'll know the result. But I'm recording this right before the Padres and the Braves start, which, yeah, I hate the Braves. I don't know about you, but I have Spencer Strider under 7.5 strikeouts. Padres have been the hardest team in the MLB to strike out so far this season. So I'm riding that. As much as I do like betting Spencer Strider over strikeouts, I'm taking under 7.5. So you can go to FanDuel.com/lockedon. That is FanDuel.com/lockedon to learn more. Thanks again for making Locked On Gators your first listen of the day. We are available daily and free wherever you listen to podcasts. And we talked about the good with Max Brown, the athleticism, the arm talent, the ceiling. He brings that for you. But we do have to talk about the bad here. This is going to be different from when we talked about Graham Mertz or when we talked about Jack Miller, because this isn't necessarily what can't he do. This is, we don't know really what he can do. We can talk about no experience. And like I mentioned last segment, Cole, I'm so sorry. I will look up your last name right now. But the point of Cole's comment was, if we're going with inexperience, I'd rather go with Max Brown because of the ceiling, of course. It's Cole Prescott. He said, honestly, if we're going with inexperience, I'd rather take the one with the stronger arm, Max Brown. You would also be taking the one with more youth. You'd also be taking the one with more athleticism. You're taking the one with less experience, though. That's the big thing for me, where experience is the thing that matters, especially when you're in the SEC. That matters. Neil Boswell, I believe it was, that left a comment when I talked about Graham Mertz, was, I think that he'll be the starting quarterback simply because of the experience. simply because he knows what it takes to be a starting quarterback, not in the SEC, but in the Big Ten for multiple years. So bringing that over matters. They're all fair points. That's the thing. With every quarterback in this competition, they all have things that the other quarterbacks don't. And they all have things, or they all don't have things that the other quarterbacks do, which we'll talk probably more about next week when we gear up for the spring game. But the no experience thing is probably the biggest thing that's going against Max Brown, because you can also look at the numbers from high school that we talked about that were great. He did those against relatively weak competition in Tulsa. So you can kind of take those numbers and say, yeah, they gave us the film to watch. But when you watch the film, you see he's not playing against elite talent in the state. He's not playing against elite talent in the country. None of that. So you can talk about that and you can kind of bring it all up. You could also talk about how Billy Napier last year, the one who gave Max Brown the scholarship offer, the one who took Max Brown from Central Michigan. You can talk about Billy Napier there, and Billy Napier publicly has said, last year, and obviously he said this last year, but he was like, hey, Max Brown needs a year. Like he needs a year to get up to the college game because he played weaker competition in Oklahoma. So going from weaker competition in Tulsa to the SEC is a massive leap. So yeah, he's going to need that year. But guess what matters there as well? Max Brown, for the leaps and bounds that he's made in his time in Gainesville, I think that's also very important to acknowledge with Max Brown, is that he's improved significantly since getting on campus. He hasn't been on campus for a year yet. And coming from the offense he played in Tulsa to Billy Napier's offense, not only just learning a new offense, but trying to learn how to play quarterback in the SEC after playing quarterback in Tulsa, it's a lot that goes into it. And I think that's why Billy Napier is like, yeah, he needs a year. He needs to learn the offense. He needs to adjust, the massive adjustment. There are a few players that have to make bigger adjustments than Max Brown had to make from high school to college. Okay? Because Florida brings in a lot of guys from these powerhouse programs in Florida. That's not what you did with Max Brown. How Chris McClellan last year came from a higher caliber high school in the same state of Oklahoma. So this is something where Max Brown needed to make that climb and needed to make that adjust and needed to adjust and needed to make that adjustment. And he's doing that. He needs to develop, and he has been developing. But when Billy Napier took Max Brown in, a big part of it was he needs time, but his ceiling is very high. It's not Anthony Richardson high, but his ceiling is very high. And that's kind of the biggest selling point for Max Brown, right? It was the biggest selling point with Anthony Richardson. It's the biggest selling point right now with Anthony Richardson in the NFL draft. It's that of the guys that are in the draft, Anthony Richardson has the highest ceiling. For Florida, of the guys that are on roster that are in your quarterback room, Max Brown almost definitely has the highest ceiling because he does. The athleticism, the arm strength, the pure arm talent. Yeah, he's pretty high up there. But again, he needs to learn how to play quarterback. And by learn how to play quarterback, I mean, when you watch the tape from him in high school, you see throwing into double coverage when he probably shouldn't, and he in the SEC wouldn't get away with that. You can sometimes get away with it in the SEC, but to the extent that he did it, you're not going to get away with that in the SEC. You're going to throw a lot of picks. So you kind of look at that and say, okay, you're not fantastic at reading defenses. Or you can read it and you're just like, I know my arm. I have an SEC arm. I'm playing against not SEC talent. I'm going to throw that thing and I'm going to get it. And you can argue that that's a fair assessment. That's a fair evaluation. You could say that. So you look at that not necessarily having the best ability to read a field. You can look at, there were quite a few plays in Max Brown's tape where he ran the ball when he had open receivers to throw to, or at least single cover receivers where we've seen him make the throw against double coverage. You can make the throw against single coverage. And we saw him run the ball, and he did that effectively. Like that, it's not that he did a bad thing by running the ball, but you want your quarterback to, especially deep downfield, if there's a throw to be had, You want them to take that throw instead of running and making plays with their legs and having to rely on juking out two guys on the run to pick up a first down and solid plays or even score that touchdown. But ideally, your quarterback makes the throw that leads to that. So the ceiling is there. We know that. But I think the reason Max Brown probably won't be the starting quarterback is because he still needs a lot of work to be done. He does. And that's not a knock on him. He came in as a 3-star quarterback that should have been a 4-star quarterback. I don't care what anyone says, but a 3-star quarterback from low level competition in Oklahoma, which is probably why he remained a 3-star instead of a 4-star, even though his senior year was just record after record. But you look at what Max Brown did in high school, you watch the tape, you look at the numbers, you see that he's improved a lot, but that he's still got a bit of a ways to go. And that's fine, you know? But Florida does have a few other options at quarterback, and we need to see what it means for them if Max Brown does start. If Max Brown is named the starting quarterback, which again, I'd say there's like a 2% chance that happens, and I'm being generous, but we will talk about the options here. But if Graham Mertz isn't the starter and it's Max Brown, that's a different scenario than if Graham Mertz isn't the starter and it's Jack Miller III. Because if you lose that battle to Max Brown, you can almost guarantee Graham Mertz transfers out. Almost guarantee that. You can almost guarantee Graham Mertz transfers out. If he loses that battle again, whether he leaves in the second window that opens in 9 days or 8 days at this point. I had the date wrong. But if he hits the second window, he could do that, which probably won't happen. But again, if he were to lose this hypothetically, then he'd probably hit the window. He'd probably hit the portal in the second window and leave. Or he can do what I mentioned Wednesday with if Jack Miller starts. And honestly, if Max Brown, now that I'm trying to talk myself into it, if Max Brown is named the starter, which I'm not talking myself into that, I would love it. I'm a big Max Brown fan, but I don't think it happens. If Max Brown were to be named the starter, does that make Graham Mertz more likely to stay for the season than Jack Miller III? Because initially I was like, well, if you lose to Max Brown, you're probably leaving. But if you lose to a guy who has no college football experience outside of practice and is thought of as a raw developmental quarterback, if you're Graham Mertz, do you think of that as, well, now I have to stay because when he steps up to the SEC, there's a pretty good chance he's going to struggle. Maybe that's my wedge into the starting role. Or is he going to think of it as, well, we saw Anthony Richardson struggle quite a bit last year. Never even thought of sitting him down, even after Jalen Kitna's awesome game against Eastern Washington. So, and because confidence is obviously incredibly important for a quarterback. So does Graham Mertz go, well, he could struggle and he has a short leash and I get the starting spot? Or is it he's probably not going to get benched even if he does struggle because that'll kill his confidence and you don't want to kill his confidence? So that's an interesting actual decision that I'd like to hear your comments to it. I'd like to hear your reactions to that in the comments and your answers to it, where if Max Brown were to win the starting quarterback battle, as unlikely as that is in this hypothetical, if Max Brown wins the starting quarterback battle, does that make Graham Mertz more likely to transfer immediately or more likely to stay for the season in hopes that he gets a starting role? So I'd like to hear your answers on that. Jack Miller III, I think he's gone. Because if he loses to Max Brown, he's almost definitely QB3 on this team, where if Graham Mertz stays, you'd have Graham Mertz for 2024. You'd have Max Brown for 2024. You'd have DJ Lagway for 2024. You'd have maybe Austin Simmons for 2024. You'd bump down to right above the walk-ons probably. So if Jack Miller loses and Max Brown wins the starting quarterback battle, Jack Miller probably leaves. If Max Brown doesn't win the starting quarterback battle, but Max Brown is QB2 over Jack Miller III with Graham Mertz starting, probably see Jack Miller III leave as well, because that's what happens as well. DJ Lagway, Austin Simmons. If Max Brown wins the starting quarterback battle, then that leaves DJ Lagway and Austin Simmons with the worst outcome, because if Graham Mertz starts and has a great year, he's to the NFL. If it's Jack Miller III, if Jack Miller starts and has a great year, he's going to the NFL. Okay? If Graham Mertz starts and doesn't have a great year and he decides to come back for 2024, then DJ Lagway and Austin Simmons compete with him. If Jack Miller III starts and has an okay year, then he probably comes back. And guess what? He competes for 2024 as well. But if Max Brown wins the starting quarterback battle, then you've got the youngest scholarship quarterback on roster going against two new quarterbacks stepping up to the SEC, but he'll have a year of experience. So Max Brown starting is probably the worst case scenario for DJ Lagway and Austin Simmons, but it's also the least likely outcome to the quarterback situation right now. But this is like, I feel like when I'm talking about this right now, I'm way less composed than I was when talking about Graham Mertz as a starter or Jack Miller as a starter. And I feel like I'm that Charlie Day video from Always Sunny in Philadelphia, where he's like going off on the rant. He's got the strings behind him connecting the conspiracy theorist board. Like, I feel like that's me right now when I'm talking about if Max Brown does win the starting quarterback battle. But I'd love to see it. I would, because I do like Max Brown, but I wouldn't want to see it yet. I just want to see him in the spring game. Can we get Max Brown in the spring game, and then I'll be able to have an educated opinion of it, hopefully. Nice. Thanks for making Locked On Gators your first listen of the day. We are available daily and free wherever you listen to the podcast. We'll be back Monday to talk more Florida Gators football. For Locked On Gators, I'm Brandon Olsen. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter at WNS_Brandon. Find all my written work with Whole Nine Sports, Giants Country, and NFL 33. And I will see all of you, I almost said tomorrow, Monday.